Hey guys, welcome to PCA Distance Learning. This is World History Chapter 29, Nationalism and Revolution Around the World. This is Lesson 146, or the third section, entitled Upheavals in China. Hope you guys have been enjoying spring break. You've had a chance to charge your batteries a little bit, get outside, enjoy the sunshine and the warmth. And hopefully this week coming up, we'll get a clear sense of how the year is going to end, what are going to be the plans for final exams and graduation and all that neat stuff, and how that's all going to come together. And let me preface this lesson by apologizing to my international students. I've got a little bit of French and a little bit of Spanish and a little bit of German and a little bit of Russian and a little bit of Latin, and no Chinese whatsoever. So I'm going to be butchering some proper names. And just to complicate my life, I learned all these names under an older system of transliteration. So I'm going to refer to people like Jiang Jieshi as Chiang Kai-shek. And I just have a tough time letting go of the names that have been in my head for 40 years, and now I'm being told, well, we have a different way of turning that set of Chinese characters into an English spelling name. Right, there is a new way to say that, and I struggle, and the old names are still on the tip of my tongue. So please bear with me on those issues. All right, let's talk a little bit about the revolution in China that sets up the Chinese Republic. The Revolution of 1911, or the Xinhai Revolution, is going to topple the Qing dynasty, which had been established way back in the 17th century, 1636, and ruled China for about 270 years. And Sun Yizhan, and I would call him Sun Yat-sen, sought to overthrow the Qing using what were known as the three principles of the people. Nationalism, that is, independence from foreign imperial domination. Representative government, the rights of the people, sometimes translated directly as democracy. And third, economic security, people's livelihood, a concern for the welfare of the common man. And Sun is unique today as perhaps the only leader of the anti-Qing factions, which is honored both in Taiwan, in the Republic of China, and mainland China, the People's Republic of China. Now, Sun was certainly a leading anti-government revolutionary. Certainly, there were many other groups that collectively made up what were called the anti-Qing movements among the Han people of China. The Qing, again, had come out of Mongolia. They were seen as foreigners. They were seen as not truly native Chinese. And one of the key turning points here will be the Wuchang Uprising that will start in October of 1911. The Qing had developed a plan to nationalize various existing local railroads and to transfer control of those local railroads to foreign banks in exchange for loans. The Railway Protection Movement was a protest against the Qing economic direction in the Sichuan province. The Qing mobilized troops from another nearby province, from Hubei, and it left revolutionaries, particularly in and around the city of Wuhan, an opportunity to act without the garrisons that would normally have been present. And the uprising that took place would end in the abdication of the 6-year-old Emperor Puyi on the 12th of February, 1912. Now, China is not going to have an easy time figuring out what the next step looks like. Sun Yizhan is going to be more successful at destroying the Qing that at building a replacement structure. He would be initially recognized and installed as president of China. But there were other people who wanted power, and Sun did not want to contest the position as president, particularly to Yuan Shikai, a former Qing general and government official who had a great deal of experience, wealth, ties to the army. Other local leaders supported Yuan Shikai. And so Sun would step down as the national president and simply serve for a period of time as the party leader of the Nationalist Party of China, what was known as the Kuomintang, often abbreviated KMT. And the Kuomintang will win the 1913 elections in the Chinese National Assembly. The floor leader of the KMT, Song Jiran, would seek to limit the power of the president Yuan Shikai. And he would be assassinated on the street on the 20th of March, 1913, and certainly many minds suspected that the sitting president was getting rid of this person who was seeking to undercut his power. The KMT pushed for a constitution and a new presidential election, and particularly they criticized Yuan Shikai's handling of various foreign loans. It seemed like a lot of the money stuck either in his hands or those of his friends and family. And Yuan would then launch a crackdown on the KMT, and Sun would actually flee China for a period of time and go to Japan and call for another revolution against the Republic of China. Yuan would take firm control of the government. He tried to create a new dynasty so that his offspring would take a throne after he did. The army was not particularly supportive of this idea. And Yuan stayed in power as long as he stayed alive, but he was unable to hand power to his family members. He died in 1916. And across the country, it was almost as if the idea of national government had died. Various local warlords took power, battled each other. This was a very tough time to be a peasant in rural China, where various warlords would impose heavy taxes for their own personal benefit. Local bandits sprang up, in many cases unable to pay their own taxes, and tried to prey on those around them. As farmers are giving up the land and not growing crops, well, that means there's not enough food, so we're going to see famine. This is just a rough time. At the same time, we're seeing a very substantial foreign imperial presence in China. Merchants and missionaries and troops that have been landed to protect them dominated many of the Chinese port cities. Japan sent what were known as the 21 demands to Yuan Shikai in January of 1915. This is still a year and a half or so before he dies. And the purpose of those 21 demands were to ensure Japanese control over Manchuria. Now, Yuan has no interest in doing this, but he looks at Japanese power and doesn't understand how he can effectively counter it. And his answer is to concede some, but not all, of the Japanese demands. The Japanese will push for control over the Shandong province that had been taken by Germany in 1914. And the Chinese government temporarily accepted that position, and it was secured in the Versailles Treaty of 1919. Now, when it's released in China that Japan is going to get control of Shandong, there will be a significant popular protest. and this will collectively be labeled the May 4th movement, which starts in 1919. This is the date that the news is released in China. Student protests break out in Beijing. They will spread to other major Chinese cities. This is a nationalist opposition to a Japanese role on Chinese soil. The people of China will organize an economic boycott against trade with Japan, and that will spread rather rapidly across much of the country. Chinese reformers basically want to use Western knowledge and techniques to enable China to control its own future. Sun himself spoke of other countries as a carving knife and serving dish, and China as the fish and the meat that are getting carved up. At this point in time, the Confucian traditions that were attached to historic Chinese dynasties seem rather inadequate, and newer ideas seem more promising. Certainly among those would be democracy and nationalism. This is a time when there is some social unrest. Women are campaigning against traditional practices of arranged marriage and foot binding, and married women being secluded at their homes. The May 4th movement had the effect of strengthening the KMT, which had not been associated with Yuan Shikai's deal with Japan. Now, while democracy and nationalism are some of the modern ideas that were being brooded about, certainly there are others, including Marxism. Some Chinese turn to the revolutionary ideals of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. The Russian Revolution, the Second Revolution of 1917, provided the model of how a strong, disciplined party could transform a nation. The Chinese Communist Party, and we'll abbreviate that based on English terms rather than Chinese terms, so it will be easier to translate CCP, Chinese Communist Party, compared to KMT, Chinese Nationalist Party. The Soviet Union will soon link arms with the Chinese Communist Party and send a group of advisors led by Mikhail Borodin over to China in 1923. Now, initially, elements of the Chinese Communist Party worked together with elements of the Kuomintang or Nationalist Party to defeat various local warlords. Both had the common goal of building up a unified national government that would run China. I think if we look on page 736, we see a map there of civil war in China. Might be worth looking at as you listen to this portion of the lecture. Now, Sun Yizhang will die in 1925. Sun Yat-sen, as I'm used to calling him, he is now off the stage. And his replacement will be a young army officer named Jiang Jieshi. And again, I tend to want to call him Chiang Kai-shek. Jiang had studied in Moscow and became the leader of the Chinese Nationalist Party. He was less interested in democracy or communism than smashing warlords and uniting China. He was based out of the southern capital of Nanjing, and by 1926 had organized a military drive toward northern China, gaining much territory and eventually the northern capital of Beijing. Now, up until this point, the KMT and the CCP had worked together. Jiang, as leader of the KMT, looked at the Chinese Communist Party with its links to the working class as a potential threat to the future of the Nationalist Party, which had most of its support among the middle class, landlords, businessmen, and the like. because the Chinese Communist Party was affiliated with Russia, Chiang also saw it as a violation of the three principles of his mentor, Sun Yat-sen. The CCP brought an element of Soviet influence over Chinese politics. And so the alliance between the CCP and the KMT split in April of 1927. Jiang Jiechi took the right-wing or more conservative approach. Chen Duxiu of the Chinese Communist Party took the left or more radical approach. The KMT supporters in the coastal cities of Shanghai and further south in Guangzhou, which the foreign traders had always called Canton, would then conduct a purge of the most prominent Chinese communists in their area. And in the physical attacks that took place at the end of April, early May 1927, somewhere around 3,000 Chinese communists would be killed. One man who will escape that fate is Mao Zedong. And he is a communist who will be in a leadership position at this time and who will become much more important moving into the future. Now, Mao was not terribly interested in reading Marx in a literal sense. Marx is all about urban working class. And Mao looks around him and says, you know, we don't have that many factories. What we have is a whole lot of rice farmers, peasants. So we need to work on building support among the peasants because they're the majority of the people. Mao understood that the Kuomintang or the nationalists had a position of great advantage. Certainly in terms of raw numbers in early 27, it would be hard for anyone not to believe that the nationalists would end up victorious. But Mao believed that communism would come to a long-term victory in China. He said a single spark can start a prairie fire. And his approach was organizing the peasants in southeastern China. Now we're going to come to an event that will ensure the long-term survival of the CCP, and B, elevate Mao to a position of primacy within the CCP. And that will be known as the Long March. Jiang Jiechi will unleash a wave of attacks against the CCP, which he called Red Bandits, and he would begin a number of encirclement campaigns where his people would build blockhouses in a particular area, try to seal routes of ingress and egress, then go inside and root out those who were identified as communists. The Force 4 had some limited success. They gained ground, but they really did not do a very good job of consolidating nationalist control over the people. The fifth campaign is going to be the most effective at hemming in the Chinese Communist forces. And as the nationalist forces launched their attacks, which seemed to be particularly worrisome in comparison to the first few attempts, the Chinese Communist Party decided to abandon Hunan and march west and north to Yan'an. They started with around 100,000 supporters on a 6,000-mile march. Now, if you put that all in a straight line, that's like going from Boston to San Francisco back to New York. And the Chinese communists had the presence of mind during this rapid retreat, while they're desperately scrambling to stay in front of the KMT followers who are chasing them down to observe 3 primary rules: to obey orders, to not steal, and to turn in all loot captured from the KMT. Not stealing from the peasants, not foraging for food, not grabbing anything you see, not bothering the farmer's wife or his daughter. The CCP encouraged their forces to be polite to peasants, to avoid damage to crops, and to pay for anything that they wanted to take. Now, the Long March, which is shown on the map there in, call that fire engine red, little orangey, is going to hamper both the Chinese communists and the nationalists who are chasing them. Hunger is going to be a real problem. It's very difficult to forage while you are consistently on the run. And ultimately, about 20,000 Chinese communists arrived safely in Yunnan. So they lost 80%. 1/5 survived the Long March. And that event, 1934 to 1935, consolidated Mao's leadership. He is the leader of the CCP at this point. And the Long March certainly served as a symbol of Chinese communist determination. Mao would set up new bases in Yunnan and seek to rebuild his forces while Chiang was preparing his next round of attacks. Excuse me, sorry. Now, what happens will be a little bit of a surprise to both, and that will be Chinese invasion. Now, the Chinese had set up their puppet state in Manchuria, known as Manchukuo, from 1932 to about 1945. It really won't end until the end of World War II. Japan had experienced major economic problems in the World Depression that came out of the American stock market crash and the Great Depression in the U.S. The various international economies all consolidated, stopped buying foreign goods, and a massive drop in international trade particularly hurt the Japanese, who were involved in a great deal of import-export operations. They imported raw materials, manufactured them, and sent them on. Nobody was buying their products. They couldn't buy raw materials. They had very little income. Things were not working well at all. In Japanese history, sometimes this is called the Showa Depression. English translations often refer to it as the National Economic Crisis. Multiple voices inside Japan called on the government and the military to seize the resources necessary to control Japan's own destiny. A document known as the Tanaka Memorial. Now, the authenticity of that document has been challenged repeatedly. Scholarly opinion is divided. Certainly, there are many, many reservations about whether it's real. But it carried weight because it appeared to represent ideas that were on the streets in Tokyo. Would be published in China in December of 1929 as a plan that had been allegedly produced by Japanese Prime Minister Tanaka back in 27 that featured what was known as the horse and rider strategy. Now, I'll let you figure out in that analogy which of the two countries was going to be the horse, the bigger country, and who would be the rider. And the Japanese seem to be in the leading position for that role. Now, the Japanese Army, the Imperial Japanese Army, the IJA, had a portion that was stationed on mainland Asia, and that was known as the Kwantung Army. And certainly that was a hotbed of radicalism, ultranationalism inside Japan, and they would stage what would be known as the Mukden Incident on the 18th of September 1931. Lieutenant Kawamoto of the Kwantung Army took a package of explosives and planted it near a set of railroad tracks over which a Japanese train was due to run. Now, he blew off the explosives, and the explosion was so mild that the train ran over the tracks 10 minutes later without any problem. So, on a scale of 1 to 10, this is a crisis of 0.001. The Kwantung Army, again, a Japanese force, accused Chinese dissidents of an attack on Japan. And the only logical answer was to seize Manchuria. And the Japanese, would make that happen militarily, and by 1932 create this puppet state called Manchukuo, where they would haul the Puyi emperor out and establish him as a figurehead. Now, China's going to get on the phone, dial 1-800-GENEVA, yell help to the League of Nations, who will send out a report led by Lord Lytton from Britain. He will investigate, and he will publish a report in 1932 saying, the Japanese excuse for this is bogus. The Japanese conquest and takeover of Chinese territory is inappropriate. Japan needs to get out of Manchukuo. And the Japanese answer to this is to stand up in the League of Nations and say, we're not going to be talked to in these sort of terms. We're out of here. They throw the report down and walk out of the room. 1933. And this is going to create something of a problem for Jiang Jiechi, because he is supposed to represent the authoritative national government of China. And in his mind, priority one is, let's beat the CCP. Let's make sure that we end up in control of China. And a lot of his supporters are saying, look, we're all Chinese. Let's go get those Japanese foreign invaders. And so there's going to be a division within the ranks of the KMT about who is priority one here. All right, we're going to see about 5 years of Manchukuo under Japanese control, and then we're going to come to the Second Sino-Japanese War, which will last from 1937 to 1945. And a lot of people will call this the Pacific Theater of World War II. And you can argue that World War II starts in the Pacific, because this is going to begin before the German attack on Poland, which would be 39. This is going to start in 37. It begins with what's known as the Marco Polo Bridge incident. And this takes place on the 7th of July in 1937. A Japanese sentry goes missing. And the Japanese, who have the only data about the situation, they claim their guy is missing. The Chinese don't know that. They demand the right to search Chinese land looking for this soldier, claiming he's been abducted by Chinese troublemakers, as opposed to, say, getting drunk, falling down in a ditch, breaking his leg and smashing his head, running off with his girlfriend, whatever. No, Chinese dissidents did this. The Chinese won't let the Japanese search Chinese land, so this is a major problem. Fighting breaks out. Local commanders of higher authority try to patch together a truce, which was very tentative. And the Chinese Communist Party will then launch a military attack on Japanese soldiers, which leads to a major escalation of the fighting. And the Japanese will drive south into what we call mainland China, the area occupied by the Han people, especially along the coastal regions. Now, the Japanese army was very well equipped. It was very well trained. They're going to take Beijing, the northern capital. They're going to take Shanghai as a major trading city. They're going to take Guangzhou. They're going to look to grab the coastal cities to cut off aid that could be delivered to China. Jiang Jiechi is forced to retreat not only out of Beijing, but out of his southern base at Nanjing, and he will retreat up the Yangtze River to Chongqing. The Japanese forces would advance inland from Shanghai and take Nanjing after about a week of fighting in December of 1937. I think on page 737 in your book, you have a little primary source reading there about the massacre in Nanjing, and you look at the horrors there that Chinese civilians faced. The Japanese Central Area Army under General Matsui was basically allowed to run rampant for a number of weeks, in which they committed untold murders and rapes and looting and arson. At the end of the Nanjing massacre, there are about 200,000 dead and an estimated 20,000 Chinese women were raped by Japanese soldiers. Now, both of those numbers are estimates. You can find estimates that are lower. You can find estimates that are higher too. And certainly you're going to be seeing more incidents as the Japanese soldiers will attack British and American civilians in that process. And so where we finish here is a three-cornered war in China from 37 to 45, an 8-year window. And about halfway through that 8-year window, in 1941, in December, in Hawaii, the Japanese are going to attack the United States. The United States will get involved in a major way in the war, and they will aid the KMT, the Nationalist Party, over the CCP, or the Communist Party. And certainly during the war, the Nationalists appeared to be the stronger faction in China. We'll see that outcome after the war concludes. Hey guys, go forth, do great and wonderful things. Stay safe, enjoy the nicer weather outside. God bless.